And I think this is a great segue in order to start our first panel of the morning, which is on emerging threats in disinformation, in cyber, in space, and in other technologies. And so it is a real honor for us to invite our various panelists, who's going to be led by our moderator, who is Monty McGee. He's the Director of Security Partnerships and Engagement at the Edison Electric Institute.
Thank you to the organizers, the entire FIU team. This has been a great conference so far. Really enjoyed day one, and I could not have asked to be a part of a better panel to kick us off for day two. We were actually in the back enjoying the music because we thought that was our intro music as we were going to prepare. So it was a little tough because we thought we were in the club for a bit, but. In all seriousness, we are here to talk about a really important topic that at different points throughout yesterday and even this morning, you've heard references to. And I want to pick up on a lot of those themes throughout the discussion today. But to get things started, I'd like to just go through the panel in terms of introductions and titles, and then set the framework for the discussion. But really, I want to make sure that we leave enough time for your questions. And so I will ask one round of questions, but then really turn it over to you. So as Leland noted, my name is Monty McGee. I serve as the Director of Security Partnerships with the Edison Electric Institute. And to my left here, we have Monica Ruiz, Senior Government Affairs Manager of Digital Diplomacy with Microsoft. Next to Monica, we have Hugo Miguel, former Undersecretary of Planning, Information and Communications Technology Secretariat, and an Argentine space expert. Then we have Roberta Braga, Founder and Executive Director, Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas. And next to Roberta, we have Dan Restrepo, Senior Fellow for the Center for American Progress. And then, of course, you all know Randy Pestana, Director of Cyber Policy, the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy here at FIU. So as the agenda notes, this panel will explore the dynamic landscape of emerging threats in cyberspace, including cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and integration of AI. As I said, I want to kind of frame the discussion a bit before turning to the questions from the experts here on the panel. So artificial intelligence, AI, or IoT devices, Internet of Things devices, and other emerging technologies have the potential to dramatically improve and transform our way of life, but also present a spectrum of risks that could be harmful to societies across the region, some of which could have catastrophic effects. Emerging technologies could be misused by foreign adversaries, terrorists, and less sophisticated bad actors to cause widespread harm and threaten a nation's security and economic prosperity. According to the State Department's recently released strategy in cyberspace, nearly all foreign policy issues, from international security to democracy and human rights to global health and climate change, all will be shaped by today's investments in cyberspace and digital technology diplomacy. Cybersecurity, data security, and cyber resilience are prerequisites for and enablers of economic growth, healthy civic spaces where citizens can exercise their rights. And so with that framework in mind, I want our discussion to really focus on kind of in analyzing the emerging threats from a policy, technology, and people perspective. And you'll hear that throughout the questions. And then we're also going to start at the global level and really work down to the local. So to get us started, I'd like to turn to Monica. So Monica, can you discuss the importance of international cooperation in cyberspace and how private companies like Microsoft can work with governments to promote standards of good behavior in cyberspace and mitigate some of the risks that I just talked about?
Well, thank you so much, Monty, for framing the panel so eloquently, and also a shout out to Leland Lazarus for organizing this incredible conference and for the opportunity to join as one of the speakers in this session. I did want to touch on that, but before I wanted to frame my remarks in terms of some of the threats that we're seeing from a Microsoft perspective. So Microsoft releases an annual report called the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, where we essentially provide an assessment of what the digital threat landscape looks like. The company actually synthesizes 65 trillion security signals a day. And so this gives us a very unique vantage point to what this environment essentially looks like, how actors are behaving. And some of the key threats that we're seeing is first around AI. I think yesterday's panel talked about some of the risks associated with AI, and I'm also very eager to talk about some of the benefits that emerging technologies, particularly AI, provide to defenders. But the truth is that if you look at the intersection of AI and cybersecurity, there are some risks associated with that, not only in terms of automating phishing campaigns and malware, but serious concerns also in the misinformation space. We're also looking at different incidents that focus on cyber espionage. This also sort of comes back to what happened in 2020 with SolarWinds, when it was clear that a state actor used a software update mechanism to engage in cyber espionage operations and essentially affected 18,000 organizations to get at US agencies and information that US agencies had. And so you're seeing a rise in that sort of activity on the espionage side of things. Also wanted to touch on hybrid threats. The previous keynote speaker touched on that, but I'd like to add an additional dimension in terms of cyber information, but also kinetic. So in a Ukrainian context, you're seeing some coordination, and in fact, Microsoft has seen some coordination of kinetic and cyber operations in that theater. And of course, attacks on critical infrastructure. This is something that we've seen rise these past few years, and it's something that is of great concern to us. So Monty, to turn to your specific question, I think it's fair to say that threats in cyberspace are increasing, not only in scale, but in speed and sophistication. And this, of course, is concerning because it re-emphasizes the fact that the cyber domain has become an escalating domain of conflict. And from a Microsoft perspective, this, of course, denotes the need for responsible and positive standards to promote good behavior in this space. And a key aspect of that from our perspective is partnerships, as Admiral Fowler said, and good collaboration across the board. And so to dive into this a little bit deeper, I wanted to touch on 3 different categories in terms of how Microsoft thinks of working with governments to promote standards of good behavior. The first one is engaging in international forums. As part of the digital diplomacy team, we engage in 2 processes at the UN. The first one is a first committee process, which is called the Open-Ended Working Group, which focuses on existing and potential threats to ICT, so information and communications technologies. And as part of that, we advocate for responsible state behavior online, and we provide position papers to what the chair of the Open-Ended Working Group releases. So this is our way of providing our insights based on the topic of the negotiations that are taking place as part of the UN Open-Ended Working Group discussion. We also organize side events on topics that are relevant to these negotiations. So just this past March, for example, I joined the US delegation in the Open-Ended Working Group discussions, and also organize 4 different events with partners on what we call cyber mercenaries. So think of private sector offensive actors, the NSOs of the world. A second event on the applicability of international law in cyberspace, again, an issue that is very prominent in international fora, and the international community has agreed to the fact that international law does apply. The question is how it applies and how it's interpreted in different countries. A third event on AI and deepfakes. The previous keynote speaker said that this is a key issue of our time, and this year, 2024, is a monumental election year. Billions of people are going to the polls. So what does that look like in terms of threats, not only from the cyber side of things, but also the information side of things? And I know other panelists will touch on that. And the fourth event that we organized was around foreign influence campaigns in a Latin American context. And the third way we engage in that international pillar, as I mentioned, is organizing threat briefings. I mentioned the Microsoft Digital Defense Report that we release on an annual basis, but being present in open-ended working group discussions allows us the opportunity to organize deeper dives into insights that we release through the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. So that's sort of like pillar one in terms of how we work with governments and international fora. The second category that I wanted to touch on is engaging governments bilaterally. And so something that the digital diplomacy team does at Microsoft is contribute to what we call multi-stakeholder compendiums. And this is a model by which we have a government actor that we work with, an industry actor, in this case, Microsoft, and a civil society actor. And we look at an issue area that is of mutual importance across the board. And so an example of that would be a compendium that we released with the government of the Czech Republic and the Cyber Peace Institute as the nonprofit partner. And we looked at what are ways that we can mitigate risks to the healthcare sector. This was during COVID. This was following incidents that the Czech Republic, unfortunately, was a victim of when they were targeted for ransomware attacks, and certain hospitals, unfortunately, had to deal with this issue during a global pandemic. And so we brought together these partners to start looking at what are actionable and practical recommendations that we can focus on across different sector groups to mitigate risks to the healthcare sector. We've done similar multi-stakeholder projects with the government of Mexico and Temple University to look at the applicability of international law in cyberspace. As I mentioned, the international community agrees that international law applies. The question now is how it's interpreted, how it applies. And so working with the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Temple allowed us the opportunity to further inform these discussions and then hopefully bring that up to negotiations that are taking place at the UN. And the third compendium we worked on was with the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, on cyber hygiene across strategic sectors. So we looked at healthcare, finance, and energy. And this was an opportunity to not only look at this issue area and contribute to the field and find ways to pull insights from different stakeholder groups, but also build those relationships with different governments on a bilateral level. And the third category, and I'll be quick, is around just building talent. Admiral Fowler made the point that it's incredibly important to build those partnerships, but also find ways to fill the talent pipeline. And Microsoft is prioritizing this as an issue that we focus on. And so we launched the Microsoft Cybersecurity Skilling Initiative with the goal of feeding roughly 250,000 individuals, or making it available for 250,000 individuals to enter the cybersecurity field by 2025. And so we're doing this through a combination of different initiatives. We're working with over 150 community colleges. We're making curriculum available for free. We're training existing and incoming faculty that are focusing on this issue. And we're providing scholarships to thousands of students, again, to facilitate the entrance of them into this very key and important field. And as of last year, the company announced that it's expanded this cybersecurity skillings initiative to 28 other countries, some in Latin America. So I was very, very excited to learn about that. So all that to say, threats are increasing, but I do think the private sector has a key role to play, and in fact, a responsibility to address these threats. And I think it's inherent to work collaboratively across the multi-stakeholder community.
Thank you so much, Monica. You hit on so many really important points, and the MDDR is such a great resource. So thank you to Microsoft for continuing to put that out. Staying global, I want to now kind of think about this from the perspective of strategic competition. And I want to turn to you, Hugo, and talk a little bit about strategic competition as it relates to technologies. So can you describe how the 5G race, the proliferation of connected devices and small satellites will expand the cyber threat landscape, and what we can do to mitigate some of those risks?
Okay. Well, talking about the 5G and the satellites, they are not competition, they are complementary. 5G is a concept, a new concept, 5G, 6G, or the G, whatever will be, are concepts or new business or the way to maintain all the walls in the air, okay? 5G have at this moment two aspects. One is the concentrated power in the main companies, other is the open RAN, with the distribution of this infrastructure. Talking about the cellular networks or the satellite networks, we are talking only about the first 5 steps of the model of open integration. You need all the models. You need the fiber optic, you need the 5G, you need the satellites, because it's not the same in the part of the world where you are. Suppose you can, with 5G, you will cover the cities, but you need satellites to cover the largest station with nothing, okay? And you need the fiber optic to link the nodes of the network. So it's not, all the networks are complementary. And in the case of the 5G, the problem to mitigate the aspects of the cyber operation is not technically, mainly is regulation. Why? Because each action of the network, it were over satellite, it were over the cellular network, someone pay the bill. So if you have someone to pay the bill of the connection, in the other part of the connection, you will find the hacker, or you will find the user, or you will find whatever wants to attack one network. The problem that the governments have to mitigate the attacks, or to solve the issue of the attribution, is to find the people, and to find the people, you need the legal tools to access to the information, because when you make one link, that link is established between one switch or one gateway, whatever, and you need the triad of attribution. That is the number of the dispositive, maybe the MAC address or the email of the phone, the IMSI card, and the ID of the user. This triad defines the user in the cellular network, but all the support that the government needs to identify the call needs the regulatory frame to obtain that information. In the case of the deployment of the network, the issue is not technically geopolitical. So we need to discuss if we need concentrate networks or open networks. And in that case, it makes the technology with the politics, with the geopolitics. In the case of the infrastructure, and the satellites will complete the deployment of the network in its isolated points. The competition between the satellite, between the satellite networks or the terrestrial networks is matter of teletraffic. You will see the people talks about, okay, we want to build IoT satellites, we want to build small sats, we will cover the countryside with small sats. But in fact, you need to calculate the teletraffic. If it is possible, the concentration of traffic in gateways to interconnect the satellites with the internet, or the concentration of traffic to trespass in the handoff from one satellite to another, will define the kind of use that you can offer with one technology or another, or the mix of technology. Probably the most important traffic will solve locally, so we can deploy networks able to connect people in a work area, and then use the satellite like a system of backhauling to send the traffic to other point. It's a mix of technologies. It's not one technology. It's not a competition between technologies. The problem is you need to separate the signal from the noise and the reality from marketing. When you start a new network, or you start a new business, you want to say, okay, you must acquire my services, and my services will solve everything. That is not true. You need the mix it, and you need to analyze what kind of technology can accomplish the necessities that you have in one particular activity. And concerning the extension of the problem of the cyber attacks or the problem of the cyber warfare, Okay, all is cyber, but nothing is cyber. Why? Because cyber is a concept too. The cyberspace is not a place. Cyberspace is a logical entity, only exists in the logical aspect. When we're talking about, okay, I'm a cyber warrior, I will block the cyberspace. What cyberspace? Because we have plenty of cyberspace. If you establish a network, you will be there, a cyberspace particular. And you can prepare people to work at any level of the X levels of the open system integration. I said 8 because the worst of the levels is the 8th one, that is the people. You can't not control the people, and the people makes the fails in all the system, okay? But the concept to work there are the same. We can prepare people, and we need to differentiate between the technicians and the scientists. The technicians, we need a lot of technicians to work in the different levels of the network. And we can close the doors in those levels of the networks. But we need to think about the science of the cyberspace like an entity, a logical entity. And we need to prepare the people to take decisions in that situation, in that world. Why? Because technology only solves the 5 steps from physical, logical, network, and transport. The other levels are content. And we need to use the content. If suppose we need to make a very resilient network where we cut the infrastructure and we need to reconnect. We need to go to a place in the content to receive and all the information that we need to reconnect the systems.
Yeah.
You have the problem of artificial intelligence that is another creativity phrase to imagine new words, but in fact are a structure of thinking that we are using to describe the way to automate some activities over the networks. But they're not a problem of threat, it's a problem to the use that the people want to make with these new opportunities. It's logical too, and it's part of the new languages.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Hugo. You highlighted for us kind of the regulatory challenges, the political challenges, and then even some of the conceptual and logical ones. So as I noted, we've now covered kind of spatial and global. Now I want to bring us a little bit back down to earth and move to national and regional as we transition to Roberta. So Roberta, your organization has done a lot of research around both kind of disinformation, misinformation, the effects on certain groups. I'm curious if you could discuss and share some of the research findings around Latinos specifically and how they engage with disinformation, the meta narratives that bad actors tend to use and how those tactics tend to manipulate certain populations.
Thank you so much, Monty. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, to be sharing this great stage and to be back in Miami. So at DDIA, we are really centering the human in approaching information integrity issues. And so what we're really trying to do is understand what the actual impact is of different sets of online harms on people, including to what extent are people actually seeing and believing false and misleading information online? What characteristics do they share? Is that type of information actually impacting their belief, but also their behavior? I feel like we usually stop at belief. Is it impacting people's behavior? And then we're experimenting with different sets of interventions to build resilience at the community level. So all of that to say, we are really centering Latino communities in this. And for us, I say Latino communities both in the United States and in the Americas. We know that disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, information generally is really cyclical and borderless, and it's especially borderless for our communities because we're engaging with everything across the region. And so I wanted to highlight two silver linings of this set of issues. I feel like we often really focus on the challenges. There are some silver linings. So the first is through public opinion research and narrative analysis, we found that most people are not actually seeing or believing disinformation online. They are very skeptical. They may be familiar with a variety of different narratives, but they're not sure 100% one way or the other if these things are true or false. I think that can be interpreted in both a positive or a negative light. It means that they're open to good information, good fact-based information, or it might mean that they're just generally distrusting of everything that they come across on the internet. And I think that we as problem solvers of this can take it in either direction. So that's the first silver lining, is most people are not falling for disinformation. And in fact, the people who do see and believe this type of thing more often are not the stereotypical types of people we usually center at this. It is not people who don't have access to correct information. It also doesn't tend to be people who have low levels of education. Not to say that those folks aren't also engaging with disinformation. Our research has found that the people who see and believe disinformation more often are actually people who have really high levels of interest in politics, who tend to be kind of conspiratorial in their tendencies already, and they're consuming really hyper-partisan information online. And so I think that's not necessarily surprising, but it means that we need to kind of shift a little bit our attention on how we approach the problem. And then the second silver lining is connected to the meta-narratives and the tactics, is that today, disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, they're actually predictable if we can get ourselves away from focusing on the specific claims. I think as human beings, we want to correct the record on something if we see that it's wrong or misleading. And we tend to get stuck on the specific claims that we see circulating at a certain moment in time. But if we take a step back, and for those of us who've been working in this space for too many years, probably, we know we can connect the dots now. If we take a step back, we see that the meta narratives and the tactics and techniques get recycled over and over and over again. And if we can just shift our mindset to addressing those meta narratives and tactics and techniques and helping people, consumers of information, to understand how to connect the dots between those things and the things they see on the internet, that is a better, in our opinion, a better approach to solving this at scale. So quick examples, some meta narratives that we've seen: election fraud, under election fraud, the meta narrative being, that there is general fraud in our election systems. Under election fraud, it's polls being rigged, dead people voting twice. If we look back at the Brazilian elections in 2018, there are already sort of election fraud narratives being built ahead of Bolsonaro's first run for office even. So the machines are rigged, things like that. And here it's paper ballots are rigged, or like you can't vote by mail because people might move your vote around or what have you. So election security, immigration, immigrants are ruining the fabric of our society. Under that, immigrants are criminals and violent. Immigrant non-citizens are voting in our elections. One side or another are flying in immigrants so that they can shift the elections. So those types of things I think are not that surprising. And if we look in every country in the region where there have been elections in the last 10 years, some of this stuff has come up. Last example, right? The hate narratives that are targeted at the LGBTQ communities. In Brazil, again, but also in Colombia and other countries back in 2017, 2018, we were already seeing the grooming narrative, right? Like LGBTQ people are grooming our kids to shift their gender identity one way or the other. That was already happening in Brazil on the domestic level. And so, and then we see it again and again and again. And so if we can just connect the dots and realize that bad actors are very much connected, that they're amplifying each other's networks, but also the narratives, then we can, I think, shift away from that. Dan Haddad talked a bit about the tactics. I just wanted to throw a couple of them in that I think you all are probably really familiar with, but don't think about that often. So emotional language, the use of emotional language generally. false dichotomies. So it's either this or this. Either you hate the news or you love your grandma. Like false dichotomies, really, they just don't make sense. Ad hominem attacks. So people detracting from the argument by attacking the person delivering that argument. Biden's age, for example. So like we see that over and over. And so I just wanted to leave it at that. It's like there are a couple of silver linings to this. It is not that it's not a manageable or solvable set of issues. And in fact, I think that we as a society have become more resilient to some of this and will continue to become more resilient as we identify some of these patterns. Maybe that's a little too optimistic. So Dan,
well,
to you.
Because we're coming to Dan next, and I want him to pick up on that point. But thanks for kind of raising our collective hope, right? As we go into a season where a lot of these meta narratives, right, will draw upon some of the worst emotions and thoughts about groups, and so thank you for giving us a little hope, Dan. I'm not expecting you to keep us hopeful given the question I'm going to ask you, but that's your challenge. So, as we think about the upcoming election in the US, I'm curious to know from you kind of how are you thinking about some of the implications for disinformation campaigns, particularly from foreign adversaries, and thinking back to the last election and some of what came out after that revealed the engagement from some foreign adversaries around the election system and some of those narratives, meta narratives that Roberta talked about. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on domestic violent extremist groups and how you think they fit into this broader discussion around disinformation.
So you're saying you don't think I can be optimistic about that set of issues?
DVE in the upcoming election, yes, that's your challenge. Make it positive.
But first of all, thank you to Monty and thank you to FIU for the invitation to be back on this stage. It's nice to be back. A couple of thoughts, and actually I'm going to take a kind of couple steps back and then get to the question as posed. I'm struck by the composition of this panel, actually, because it puts together a set of issues that I think tend to be underappreciated and overappreciated. So the kind of threats in the cyberspace, I think, is still an underappreciated set of challenges. Hasn't been at this conference. I think the FIU has done a lot of good work in this space, and a number of speakers have touched on it, and obviously panelists. But I think as a general rule, it is still kind of less visible, it's still cloaked in technical expertise, which makes it kind of harder for the rest of us to talk about it and think about it. Whereas mis and disinformation kind of suffers from the opposite problem. It is an argument that often solves or proves too much. It is a function, and it's actually not unique in that regard, right? So we're living in a very complex political moment. And by we, I mean everyone living on the planet, not just those of us in the United States. And at a pretty fundamental, what could turn out to be a pretty fundamental inflection point. I mean, it's hard for any one area of expertise to explain what is happening and explain why it's happening. And oftentimes, experts, when you kind of gather a group of experts on a complex problem, kind of each with their own discipline, the first thing that becomes evident to the experts in that gathering is that capital T, capital A, the answer is not in their lane, right? They're like, ooh, I can't solve this problem. Like my toolbox doesn't solve this problem. The second thing that often happens is that, ooh, the answer has got to be like right over there in this area that I know kind of enough about to be dangerous, but not really enough about. And I think mis and disinformation often ends up being that thing that we all know just enough about to kind of be dangerous in the space without knowing enough to go, yeah, it's an element of what's going on, but it isn't capital T, capital P, the problem, right? And it often gets treated as the problem. And I think that kind of allows me to kind of walk towards the question you actually asked me, Manu, in terms of what does that mean in the United States, in the electoral setting in the United States, and a little bit more broadly in this kind of global super cycle that we're going through in 2024. I think the biggest information challenge, and this goes to radicalization and domestic radicalization as well, is not necessarily the mis and disinformation, it's the atomization of our information environments. We have lost common facts. We've lost common experience. We've lost, as a former colleague of mine at the White House talks about, we've lost kind of casual interaction with the news. We are each curating our own reality with the help of platforms and algorithms, and I put help in air quotes, in terms of the moderation and the curation of the information environments we live in. But we live in distinct information environments. That's really hard. It's really hard to conduct a democracy when that's your reality. So I think the biggest information challenge that US democracy and democracies throughout the Americas and elsewhere face is that atomization of the information environment, rather than necessarily the pollution of the silos with mis and disinformation. In the United States, we also have a challenge that is a mis and disinformation challenge, which is actually somewhat distinct if you look at it in the Americas context. In the Americas context, it is often folks adjacent to candidates, adjacent to campaigns that purvey mis and disinformation on behalf of candidates and campaigns. That's simply not the case in the United States. We have a major party candidate who is an active purveyor of disinformation. That's different. We have now potentially the most relevant third-party candidate who is an active purveyor of disinformation. So that atomization and the pollution of the silos is not being done by external actors. It's being done, the call is coming from inside the house. So yes, there are external actors, right? And there are external actors who are endeavoring to pollute our information spaces in those atomized silos that we live in, and using technology to advance that. But I think the arguments about the role of external actors tend to end up proving too much.
Okay.
On radicalization and kind of the role of political violence, I think actually, this is kind of off topic, but not. I think we should be more worried about political violence in the United States than we are. Partly because of the information environment that we're living in, partly because of the kind of known contributing factor to radicalization that the modern information space has played, but also because we have actually a pretty long and tragic history of political violence in the United States, right? 1968 didn't happen because of the internet, which is kind of the most evident example of extreme political violence in the United States. And there's, people are seeing and hearing echoes about different parts of 1968 right now in college protests and, the coincidence of having a convention in Chicago. And, but I think there's a very real, in kind of the consulting side, I think there's real possibility both in the run up to and then the run out from election day. Mindful of the fact that, there's studies out there that say folks overestimate the other side's willingness to engage or eagerness to engage in political violence. But again, I think there's reason for concern, and the atomization and the pollution of the silos, I think, does contribute to that. I mean, in terms of like the what do you do about it? I think we've heard a bunch of what we can do about it, both in the keynote and from Roberta, right? And again, I think a really important part of what we can do about it is, and this is kind of paradoxical, sitting on a panel talking about the role of mis and disinformation, is to not use it as something that proves too much, not see it as the answer to a very complex political moment that we're living in. It's a contributing factor. It's an important contributing factor. Primarily, the calls coming from inside the House. But yes, there are other folks who are trying to exploit the openness of our society, the openness of our debate, and the nature of the information environment in which we live today.
Wow. Well, Dan, for a second there, when you were talking about polluting the information environment, I wasn't sure you were going to end on a positive note, but somehow you surprised me. You surprised me. You brought it back up. So that was impressive. Finally, and again, after Randy, we're going to move to you. So start thinking about your questions. But Randy, you know, we started kind of in space and in global context. We moved to national and regional. I'm really interested in your perspective, kind of bringing it more to the local level. And I want to ask if you can describe the role academic institutions like FIU, civil society organizations as well, how they're thinking about expanding the talent pool required to ensure the public-private sector organizations, like we've heard from some of the other speakers, can in fact mitigate some of these emerging risks in cyberspace. And I'd love it if you could also share some of the good work that the Institute is doing in terms of implementation. So not just talking about the challenge, as our keynote speaker said, but actually doing things, getting on the ground, rolling up your sleeves, and making change.
Well, thank you for the question, Monty. And it's always interesting when Dan immediately turns to stare at you as you're about to begin your remarks. Mama, I made it. Dan's looking at me. It's an interesting concept, right? And I think not all academic institutions are created equally. So this idea that all academic institutions have the different capabilities or the knowledge base or the resources, frankly, to be able to execute on different things. But I've often made the argument, and FIU has made this argument over the years, and it's worked with Southcom and others, that institutions like academic institutions can provide a way to get out of the echo chamber. Right. And playing off of what Roberta and Dan had mentioned in terms of shaping narratives that you're creating your own realities, oftentimes academic institutions can provide that alternative perspective on a situation. Those who've served in the military know large portions of your day are already planned out. You know exactly what you're going to do, what time you're eating chow, what time you're showing up, right? And all your work is based on this information, especially if you're dealing in a classified space. Academic institutions inherently in this environment, this information environment that we're play in open source information spaces and allow us to look at problems from unique perspectives. This is also why the idea of the strength of diversity matters, because it's not merely the gender diversity, it's not merely the color diversity, but it's the experience diversity, the culture, the way of thinking that you can now look at a problem from a number of different perspectives to be able to solve the problem. So going to kind of the way you framed it at the onset, Monty, this idea of policy, technology, and people. Right. The policy piece is the shaping of it. To make an effective policy requires alternative perspectives, requires well thought out information. And for those in the intel space, the idea of collecting information is not sufficient. You must process that information effectively. So the ability to collect and process that information to come out with an analytical outcome, or a policy in this case, is extremely important, right? So how do we look at cyber threats in the Americas? Thinking about where the threats are coming from. And it's predominantly for financial means. Secondarily, it's for espionage purposes, and not just country to country espionage, but business to business espionage, more recently, especially in the mining sector, where one mining company is targeting another mining company to get that contract, right? So understanding what the considerations should go in there. Information is a key policy issue. How do we share information, especially in light of the threats that we're seeing, not just from private sector companies like Microsoft and others, but also from, if I'm in Trinidad and I'm seeing these vulnerabilities, how do I communicate this with my colleagues in Jamaica to say, hey, be on the lookout for this vulnerability in your systems? Those are policy things that we need to debate, and FIU prides itself in being able to convene experts together like we're doing here to say, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? Can you share that information? Can you share that best practice so I can adopt it from that perspective? Moving from the technology piece, this is probably one of the most difficult items that we're seeing, because I think the region or the Americas as a whole has a fire truck problem. What do I mean by a fire truck problem? Well, I have a finite amount of resources, especially today, right? Although the economy is getting a little bit better, which is a good thing. But in general, we have a decision to make. Do I invest in new technologies, new softwares, or do I invest in a fire truck which citizens can see, they can feel it, they can understand what it is, right? And in representative democracy, citizens elect their leaders on things that they see are areas of growth. It's hard to quantify, hey, I prevented the trillions of cyber attacks this year. No one sees that.
Yeah.
Right? Which leaves us with outdated technology. Across the Americas, you see legacy systems that companies still aren't providing updates for anymore. Right? This leaves inherent vulnerability. So I don't think academic institutions can help play in that space, but what academic institutions can go is fight U.S. institutions, fight multilateral institutions to say, hey, this is an area that you can easily support the region in. And what it's going to allow them to do is protect themselves, protect their partners, but also bring together a stronger democratic community across the Americas. And then the people problem. And this is, it's funny because this is a security conference and you don't think of people as security, but I will say it is the #1 threat in cyberspace. And I don't think people truly understand that. So I will say it again, the people are the #1 threat in cyberspace, not just in the Americas, but across the world. Whether it's the lack of workforce, whether it's the lack of skill sets, whether it's the lack of the ability to create that general awareness for all citizens to thus protect your systems, it is no surprise that the #1 technique for initial access remains phishing attacks. That is the user. Now, there's risk management frameworks that you can adopt to strengthen your institution, and there's training that you could provide to your employees, but the statistics remain the same. Yeah. Phishing remains there. Institutionally, how do we ensure that we're training the institutions to say, hey, not everyone needs administrative rights? Right? So, but that's we don't think about it as we laugh at it because it's really simple. It's common sense, but common sense isn't common oftentimes, right? So thinking about this people problem and creating these pathways, this hygiene culture, the way it was framed that I really liked, it was a project with cyber.org and CISA that looked at, from elementary school focusing on awareness, from middle school focusing on literacy, and from high school focus on ability or skills development. And what that allows you to do is by the time 15 years have passed, you're now going into government or going into the military, going to the private sector, you're now best prepared. But we have to be patient enough to have that generational shift that it's going to come, right? You also got to create the awareness outright, right? And I think this is something that FIU has been really trying to change in our community. Again, we take our middle name seriously, is this idea that cybersecurity is a career. Growing up, again, I'm Cuban American, a first generation American here. All the people that looked like me were baseball players. I couldn't hit a curveball, so there was no shot, right? So my parents' narrative was, be a lawyer, be a doctor, be a police officer, join the military. So naturally, I joined the military, right? So thinking about, hey, I could be a doctor, police officer, or a cybersecurity professional, or something in tech. And I think that's why these gamification mechanisms, these competitions that FIU is putting on, again, with partners around the country, are really, really important. So I'm not going to self-promote FIU. I think better time served going to Q&A, but happy to talk about FIU specific programs with anyone after this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randy. And wanted to come back to Monica. Did you want to comment on that?
Just one quick point, because something Randy mentioned resonated with me, and I think this is a theme that has been manifested across the panel in terms of how we think about cyber threats and the fact that cyber is a very abstract term, right? Like you go on, a search engine, you put in cyber and you see a hacker with zeros and ones coming off the screen. Not the problem, because that makes it so unrelatable. So it's just a very mystic concept. And something Dan was saying, I think in the dis-misinfo space, I think it's a lot more personal, right? It's a lot more like it directly impacts individuals, whether it's emotionally or in other ways, like Roberta said. And so to Randy's point, like I think that's a problem with this space, right? If we're talking about cyber hygiene and better cybersecurity, how do we make it more relatable? How do we make it more understandable? How do we demystify this concept of cyber to make it easier to understand?
Yeah, no, thank you. And now I want to invite our audience to start coming to the mics, and I want to turn it to you. So please, ma'am.
Hello. Oh,
Hey.
thank you. Thank you all for your amazing insights. So my question is related to information operations in general, whether it's propaganda or disinformation. So TTPs targeting Latin America and the Caribbean differ pretty significantly between China and Russia. In fact, the AOR is often used to test out different TTPs and are applied elsewhere in the world at strategic moments. For instance, Russia may leverage its media partnerships or journalists in the region to conduct co-operations. China doesn't quite use that strategy often. So what role do you see open source intelligence playing in identifying the planning and research phases of information operations before they happen in those strategic moments? In order to flip the beliefs of those that are not quite dedicated or identify with one political ideology or party, because oftentimes you see the narrative circulating within people that already believe what they're saying. So that's my question.
Thank you. And sir, if you want to go ahead and ask your question while the panelists are thinking about their response to the first one, please.
Perfect. Patrick Mishevich for the First Council. Great panel, great inputs. Thank you. My question is in the whole panel on the crossroad of cyber and physiology. But I want to say it's great to see you, Roberta, back so soon since Concordia. I think Miami is the place for this kind of discussions. One of the fundamental issues we're facing is the hacking of our evolutionary system, particularly the dopamine-driven reward system. Various actors in industries are exploiting this system for different purposes. One of the most concerning aspects is developing of self-confirmation bias, leading to creation of echo chambers, fueling tribalism. How do we educate those who are more informed on politics to provide tools that help to break those hacks and encourage better public discourse?
Thank you. All right, so who wants to pick up on those? I imagine Roberta and Dan, but go ahead.
Sure.
Let's start with Randy, maybe. Did
Yeah, Roberta, please.
Okay.
Sure. So to the first question, what role does OSINT play? So for me, what we've seen is that these narratives don't stop. There's no like beginning and end. It's an evolution. It's a transformation. And in fact, if you look back at PSYOPs operations like from Russia, as you know, I'm sure very well, there's just been an evolution. So I think for me, what OSINT's role is really in exposing and explaining those patterns and that evolution in a way that the everyday person can understand. Not everyone has that insight behind the curtain. Not everyone is spending hours and hours online looking at different networks and who created which Facebook accounts and who's paying for them and how do they interact. And so I think part of what we're trying to do is not only analyzing the narratives, but the changes in those narratives. And I think for us, my background's in public diplomacy. And one of the most fascinating things was seeing how we measure the difference between like public diplomacy and propaganda and partnerships and engagements. And so I'm originally from Brazil. I grew up in Wisconsin. It's just, I think OSINT has a role to play in connecting the dots for people, showing change over time, and then telling a story that explains to them how that can really look like in their everyday world and how they might come across seeing it then when they're engaging on social media or in crypto platforms.
Thank you. Randy, do you have something to add?
I want to echo something that Roberta said about the importance of open source, especially in this information environment, right? It's everything's out there. It's very easy to see. And fortunately, there's phenomenal companies like Microsoft that are constantly putting out there. You don't got to go very far to see all the great things that Microsoft has done following, even in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just the information sharing, the open sourceness of their data. It's been absolutely incredible. So you can paint a better picture with open source and proper, tools and stuff like that. I do want to get to the cognition piece of it because I think it's.
Can I interrupt you before you get to the cognition, just to add to the answer to the first question? I think something Roberta said is very important in terms of explaining it in ways people can understand and that are accessible. And to harpen back to something I said earlier, that doesn't prove too much. That doesn't itself kind of end up sounding conspiratorial, right? That all kind of bad things that are happening in the AOR are as a result of external actors. Those external, at the very least, external actors are fomenting based on lived realities in the region. And it's too easy. Sometimes it's too easy an answer that that there isn't something that's being exploited, that there isn't some underlying kernel of truth to what's being, again, manipulated, but not out of thin air. And like getting that balance right, I think is super important in this space.
Can I add one really quick thing, Dan? Sorry, Randy. Just an anecdote for this. So I saw a study a few years ago that said, so again, originally from Brazil, a study that said that RT was one of the most widely watched broadcast channels in Brazil. I'm like, no, it's not. No. It's not even in the, it's absolutely not. And even though it might have a presence on social media, there is no Brazilian that I know that is out there seeking out Russia Today as like a broadcast channel for them to watch at night before they go to bed or on their phones. However, something interesting, anecdotal, but interesting is QAnon and some of the movement on the right has begun penetrating. So I talk to my family a lot. Some of my family in Brazil are very much supportive of Jair Bolsonaro and the movement and what that stands for. And my aunt would show me the accounts that she trusted on Facebook. Like that was where she was now consuming news and information. And the accounts had the blue pill, red pill photos on them, which for anyone who knows QAnon knows that that's associated with QAnon. And I asked her, do you know what this means? And she said, no. And I said, do you know what QAnon is? She said, no. But one of the very first things she asked me when I came to visit, this was like my second day, she's like, do you think that Michelle Obama is really a woman? And do you know this thing about adrenochrome, which for anyone in the room who doesn't know it, it's like the blood of children will let you live forever. It's like a QAnon conspiracy. So she doesn't know QAnon, she doesn't know that movement, but she knows the main narratives of it and is following actively the QAnon accounts as her most trusted sources. And when asked, she said, I asked her, why do you trust them? She said, because they deal in facts. And so it's just, I don't know what that tells you. Yeah.
So because we still have a gentleman, I want to move to his question, and I know we could go down this road about, QAnon, but the red pill, blue pill. Randy, did you want to address the cognition question before we move to our?
Sure, yeah, very, very quickly. And I think Dan alluded to this correctly, the messenger matters, right? Especially if it's a legitimate messenger. And what I found in 2020, I was working with a group under Facebook called CrowdTangle, trying to understand the how do we better protect against dis and misinformation targeting Black and brown communities across the state of Florida. And what we found was the messaging wasn't just the high level messaging, right? It was the messaging that followed on coming from the family members and the friends, because why would Roberta or Dan lie to me, right? They're my friends. They're not going to lie to me, right? So who it's coming from is legitimate. It's even worse when it comes from a respected public official, because when a respected public official is, well, they're educated, they're informed, they're not going to do this. But also from the how often you see it. And it doesn't have to be, and this is where the TikTok debate is crazy, that I don't understand people aren't debating, because they're like, oh, it's the data. China has my data. Well, so does YouTube. And so it's not a data issue. If you see 100 stories come in, And 3 of those are starting to shape you. Now, push that over 1,000 stories, push that over 1 million stories, push it over 10 million stories. You're now starting to shift your position, no matter how smart we think we are, right? It is starting to shape your cognition in a way that makes you believe, or at least increases the level of bias towards a set position. And that's the danger. So this idea of shaping cognition is really important. And the way it's being done is using cyber means, especially on social media, bot networks and others, to propagate this message, especially if Dan says Pepsi's better than Coca-Cola.
I would never say that.
I would never say that either.
Blasphemy.
Right? Pepsi's better than Coca-Cola. And then now I have a bot that spreads out 1,000 different ways. Coca-Cola is way better. Pepsi's bad, right? Like
The more you see it.
the more you see it, the more it starts to shape your cognition. And I don't think we truly understand the impact that that has.
Can I add something, Monty, really quick? The second question, no, sorry.
Never
Now
gonna
we're
get out of
just-
these 2 questions.
I'm sorry. One thing that we've noticed over time, and I think that we as a community make this mistake, it's not that one side's right and one side is wrong. And in fact, most of the time what we've seen, I mean, they can be right and wrong, let me just make that, but like it's not that dichotomous. So most often, and this anecdote may or may not land, but most often what we see is that people on both sides, on polar opposite sides, they are looking at the same grain of truth from the lenses of 2 different telescopes, I'll say. It's not that one believes this thing is true and one believes this thing is a lie. They both believe this thing is true, but the way in which they are justifying this thing is completely flipped on its head. So the censorship argument, for example, everyone agrees censorship is bad. Now they don't agree on who the censors are, when someone should and should not be censored, what the mechanisms for that are. So like, that's where I think the problem comes through, is like your frame of reference is just going to be different. If you have different sets of values and ideologies, it's not necessarily that the information itself is the problem. So I don't know.
Sure. I would just note though, anyone who's saying Pepsi is better than Coke is just wrong.
Yeah,
I
just
agree.
wrong.
That's
Totally.
pure
So,
disinformation.
To the extent that I was
I hope there
associated
no
with
one-
that
there's no
idea.
one-
all right. I don't know that open.
Randy.
We have 2, and,
FIU is
and
a
we have
Pepsi
managed to
school.
get Leland up to ask a question. So I want to get to Leland, but first, sir, to you.
Thank you. I'm Mark Rosenberg. I have a quick comment based upon what was just said as it relates to what we may do next year. And that is the issue of shaping cognition is fundamental, particularly when we get serious about brain chip implants. And so that's something that I think from a national security viewpoint, whole set of issues we need to look at. But my question goes to culture, and a little bit provoked by what Randy said. McKinsey published a book just recently called Rewired, which dealt with a whole set of issues that I think all of us are grappling with. But they start out the book by saying it's not, the issue is not legacy tech. The issue is legacy culture. And so I'm in a hurry, Randy. I don't want to wait another generation. So how do we deal with the issue, as you all see it, of legacy cultures in terms of the acceleration and the growing digitalization of everything we do?
So Randy, it makes me think of technical debt that organizations face, but we're talking cultural debt.
Yeah.
So Randy, and then Hugo has something as well.
Yeah, no, I would like the problems to be solved today too. Oftentimes the reality on the ground. Go tell Trini to solve their cyber problems tomorrow with no budget, with no resources, having to prevent thousands and thousands of attacks targeted towards government service sector or their tourism sector hourly, right? So it gets very difficult. And I fear that by pushing this idea of we need things now, we're going to do patchwork fixes that will ultimately leak out when the time comes. I still think we could do 2 things at once, right? I'm not ignorant to that fact. I just think we need to temper expectations to realize that we can make subtle progress over time. We can do immediate things to patch the areas that we need to patch today. Now, one thing I will say on the positive, and playing off of something that Monica said earlier, because I thought was really important, was this idea that there is a lot of hope, especially in terms of general awareness, but also the utilization of artificial intelligence. I think artificial intelligence is so important in the ability to demystify this idea of cyber, because people can understand AI because they can touch it, they can feel it with ChatGPT and everything else. They're like, oh, AI is not that scary. When you really break down cyber, cyber is really not that scary. You have to break it down, but it's more, fogged with this idea that you need to be a computer scientist with a CISSP.
Right.
It's not the case, but those in the cyber world know that. The general population doesn't know that. Now with AI, you're like, oh, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it was very easy for folks to look at mis and disinformation as a component of cyber and say, oh, yeah, I can understand that. I can see that. So it makes it really easy to kind of get into it to AI. And I think that's going to create more demands on the population to their leadership to say, hey, what are we going to do with that? And I know Monica wanted to.
Yes. No, I want to go to.
Yes, I want to say only that we need to have an interdisciplinary approach to solve the issue of the cyber. Why? Because we say like cyber a wide area of knowledge, and we need to divide in cyber warfare and in information warfare. We talk about information. I would love to work with words, but we must take into consideration the word of numbers. Why? All the discussions about the contents are mainly tactic. And when you discuss about the infrastructure, it's mainly strategic. And we need to keep an eye on the deployment of the data and the data infrastructure, because that infrastructure is part of the international flow data, is data shared strategic. And why? Because the data is paving the road of the Silk Road. And you are moving data from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere, and you are moving the information and managing information, not with the analysis of the content, with the teletraffic analysis. We need to work together in the two worlds in order to realize what are we really doing.
Yeah, thank you. And cross-border data flows is so important. Monica, did you have something you wanted to add?
I did, Monty, thank you. So Randy did warn me that him and I were going to be the cyber folks. So I'm going to reference something that Randy said that did resonate with me in terms of the positive, the benefits of artificial intelligence for the defender on the cyber side. And I do think in a cyber context, you oftentimes hear cyberspace is offense dominant, but I would argue that it's defense competitive. And artificial intelligence actually gives us the ability to automate and identify certain anomalies and patterns to provide the defender an asymmetric advantage. And so that's one thing that, Randy, thanks for teeing that up. The second thing is a question the gentleman to my right mentioned about legacy tech versus legacy culture. And I think, what comes to mind is work that an organization like the Cyber Peace Institute is doing, which they are capturing the stories of victims of cyber incidents, right? And this goes back to the theme of making it personal, demystifying it. How can you have highlight an individual story where they were the ones that were a victim of a phishing attack and how they handled it just based on their situation, based on where they're based on what was the initial vector of attack and how they were able to unfortunately get phished. And so looking at the victim's perspective not only demystifies it, but to your point, sir, it gets at that culture legacy that we're battling with right now.
All right, thank you so much. And with the few seconds we have left, I just want to thank this panel personally, because I feel like we've covered so much within an hour. And thank you to the audience for adding with your great questions. And so thank you. Join me in a hand of applause.